Everyone, welcome back. This is our video about the offer stage. So Katrina and I wanted to, we're doing these little videos for the module 4 reference checks, the offer and onboarding. And one of the things we always think about is, and we've mentioned this, if it seems like this is just the way to do it, that's probably an invitation to take a closer look and reimagine how you could do this while centering your values, because it's probably, in that snapback, this is just the way you do things. And
there's a lot of good reasons for that, right? Like good reasons in the organizations, right? You maybe don't share the pay band before you get to this conversation, or maybe you don't have that equity that allows for that open conversation, or maybe this is the first time the candidate will have ever learned about benefits and things like that. So often it's cloaked in a lot of like secrecy, and so that's where we're like, oh yeah, we should probably pause, but acknowledge that this is really tricky because organizations are systems and systems are entrenched, and there has to be kind of an alternative to kind of experience to know that can feel different, or else you just sort of go along on that same path.
And for those reasons, this is the place where we struggle with probably most in this whole reimagining of the hiring process. It's, as I think about offers, it's like there's just, in sort of the Western management way, there's like just the way you make an offer. And like whether you're making an offer to buy a building or whatever it might be, it's like this is the process. And it's often around who has information, who doesn't have information, how you go about having that conversation, the counter offers. And so this is where we really want to spend some time with the group on Wednesday to think about, like, this is the place where it could all go sideways on you. You spent all of this time building rapport and trust and psychological safety and being open and transparent. And then the offer stage is where it's like sort of pulls you back to like, this is the way it's done. And then you get into this contentious back and forth, or you don't. And then it could sort of just all sort of fall apart, all that hard work. And so, I mean, I guess there's a couple of key things that we would suggest. First is like to schedule this call. If you're going to do a call to offer the role, much like we said with the reference checks, schedule it. Like, so we're not catching someone when they're at their office or on, in transit, but like, so they can be prepared. They know it's going to be a call. They can have their notes with them. And it could just be a much more fruitful conversation when that's not sort of catching them at a random time.
I was just going to say, like, very specifically to scheduling the call is actually like letting them know in advance that like you want to talk to them about the offer, right? And so they're in that space and you're in that space. And they don't come in thinking that, oh, maybe you have some like last minute information that you need in order to consider me as a candidate. But you're both able to sort of enter that conversation knowing that there's that the agenda is to discuss an offer.
And in that, you can even loop back to that application package to say, if you want to review this before we talk, if there's any questions, then you can sort of cut to those and not have to have another conversation to say, oh, well, why don't you go look at that, then come back. What you miss is that sort of that surprise of like, hey, we want to offer you this job, and sort of get in the moment. But what you benefit from is actually having a deeper conversation. And you still get to offer someone a job, which is a really cool thing you get to do. It's I would say one of the coolest things I get to do in the work that I've been doing, and the responsibility of like, what does this mean to continue to set them up to thrive? Like, how does this start to pivot into that?
Yeah. And I think, Tim, you were saying like this should be a joyous conversation, right? Like, and so the surprise of saying we're here, is different from surprise. Here are all the elements of the offer for the first time ever. And so if you've done your kind of inclusive approach and you've created your, position discovery and your information package and all of those things, then there are considerably less surprises for the candidate, which could sneak up on you, which I think is kind of what you're saying, right? Like that if you're putting it all on the table for the first time ever, then, people are sitting there trying to figure out, like, can I negotiate this? Can I negotiate that? What is, but if you've done a really good job at making that available and sort of redirecting them to that prior to the conversation, then that level ground of saying, like, this is, these are the parameters of this kind of an offer. We've been really clear and transparent about that in the beginning. We want it to be a fair deal, for you. And so they can, read up and see what questions they have and kind of go from there as well.
Well, and as you mentioned too, the concept or the aspect of pay transparency, comp transparency, helps so much. Because how many times in this part of the process do people find out we are wildly off on comp? Like, it hasn't come up beforehand, and now, like, I thought this role was an $85,000 role, and this is really a $35,000 role, and it's for a managing director. And so it helps, although it sort of gets you closer to that the sort of end state for this. I wanted one sort of tip that I think is useful to do here, even in setting people up with, like, this is what the meeting is, review the package if to refresh your memory, starting by saying, after, look, we really enjoyed getting to meet you. We think you would be a lot of fun to work with you. You'd be great in this role. And so we're going to talk through the specifics, and I'm happy to email you a letter right after this that sort of details this, so you don't have to take notes, so that it's all written down. So, like, you have sort of that offer letter to the person that says, here's what the comp is, here's what the benefits are, here's if dependents are covered, here's how long it takes if benefits don't kick in on day one, here's the 401k or 403b and the contribution, and if there's a vesting period, and sort of all those things that people have questions about, sort of like, as soon as we have the conversation, if there's anything else, let me know, and then sort of we can answer those questions. Rather than take notes, you can't, so they're sort of busy taking notes and maybe missing some things because, again, it's another conversation where there's a lot of information flowing.
I think there's, paying attention to who's in the room, right? We've talked about, like, the decider, and, cases where multiple deciders might be appropriate or present. But really thinking about, when you're making that offer, who is in the room and what message are we sharing? Because there's quite a lot of, existing power dynamic or assumed, power dynamics because of the structures and the systems that we're a part of that, can already make people, where that can already kind of be impacting the way that conversation is had, despite best intentions or ways you enter into it. Because if you're having a conversation, with one of the two deciders, for example, you're like, oh, is the other decider, do they know this offer? Or, so you're asking those questions. But if there is one decider, then that person has hopefully been able to build a little bit of a relationship with the candidate as they've been moving through the process. And then this conversation becomes an extension of and in service to building that relationship going forward.
One of the helpful things that I've done in the past is, if you have a large enough team, we talked about, like, who's in the interview processes throughout. And one of the questions is, when might someone from the people team or the HR team be appropriate to have in those interviews? Like, is it you bring them in the second interview so you can start to ask questions, so people can ask questions from that sort of HR or people operations subject matter expert? If you do that, that often is a helpful person to then flip into the offer call as well. So they've already met the person, they know it's sort of the, quote unquote HR person. And then on the offer call, they can just provide continuity from that call into the process, into the onboarding process. So, like, it's not like, all right, Katrina, what did you talk about? Like, how did your call go? What are all the specifics? it's really because it's really that pivot into the role. And especially because that person is oftentimes going to be the one to like provide the specifics around the benefits and payroll and what's the pay cycle and everything else. And so it just sort of cuts out what could be a really bumpy entry into the organization, where like, great, it's like we made the offer, and then you have like the HR team or whoever's handling HR be like, well, do they know this? Do they not know this? And then they get into the organization like someone should have told you that. Like that was, and so it just sort of short circuits that disconnect that oftentimes happens when someone makes the offer that doesn't sort of connect back to the other aspects of the organization.
That's a great point. And it's also like, just to recognize that the person who's giving the offer, the person who might be the supervisor or, to the person who's being hired, like HR might not be their jam, right? And so they might not actually be able to speak really confidently to the ins and outs of like the benefits or things like that. And so instead of, putting that foot forward, you're actually bringing somebody in who has that like most up-to-date, most current information, who's practiced and rehearsed at giving that, lowdown to folks. And so that increases the understanding and that kind of sense of, if I have questions about this, I know who I can go to, and kind of just can help to make it, from a UX perspective, just a little bit smoother as well.
One of the cautions about this part in the process, the reference checks and the offer, is that usually the search has been going on for a little while now. If you have great candidates, those great candidates might also be interviewing elsewhere. Mm-hmm. And you're getting really close to being able to finalize this. And usually what happens is like, this isn't the only thing people in the search committee have to do. They've got like, this is sort of added on top of what their regular work. And so you're like starting to see how you can switch gears and also sort of get this off your plate and move on. And so there's a sense of urgency that comes into play for a lot of different reasons that I think is one of those aspects that makes it harder to figure out how you can reimagine this, because you're like, we've got to get through reference checks. We've got to get to the offer. So they know we're serious because we've learned that they're up for, every one of our finalists is up for another gig someplace else. And so we want to make sure that we're coming in and they know we're serious here. So with that in mind, like, how do you adapt for that part of the process where it feels like this is where you typically speed up? And again, because this is how you do the thing, which is not necessarily the best way to do it when it aligns with values of equity, justice, anti-oppression.
Yeah. And I think like, how much time, does somebody need to consider an offer? Like if you're carrying that sense of urgency through and you're delivering that offer and you're asking them, to say yes or no at the end of the call, or to give them, is it fair to give 24 hours or 48 hours, or can that be, bespoke to the situation? And how, what does candidate care look like for those folks that aren't being offered that role, that still haven't been, haven't been communicated with an update on their, their status of their candidacy? But how, like, what is fair and reasonable for somebody who's choosing to start something new with the organization or with you, and at the same time, from the organization's perspective, what does that kind of a timeline or a runway kind of, really look like? And how do you kind of honor both of those pieces?
Yeah. So that's more or less the offer.
More questions than anything.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. More, totally. Yeah. You're welcome, everyone. Here are all the questions. I'm sure you have some. So yeah, looking forward to Wednesday and really unpacking this with all of you. And so that's the offer. We'll be back with you for one more video about the onboarding.